Hello, it's Mike Bird here for another episode of the Nazareth Nicaea podcast and vodcast. We're taking a break from Jewish monotheism and we're going to move on to something different. I saw a really good book come out about the Christology of Hebrews by Bobby Jamieson, the Paradox of Sonship. This looked like such a bright, stimulating read. I had to jump into it, and it is really good. I mean, he gets into the issue of what is the nature of divine sonship according to Hebrews. And if you haven't read Hebrews for a while, let me read you from the exordium, which says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he also made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he inherited is superior to theirs." Now, that is one of the most dense and significant and important and freighted and crucial statements of Christology in the first 100 years of the church. It's very important. And in fact, the whole stream of citations from the Old Testament that you get in chapter 1 of Hebrews is very important. What it says about the Son, the way it applies, Psalm 110 to him, Psalm 45, Psalm 2, it is really just a Christological psalm fest. And Bobby Jamieson does a really good effort at going through those issues and arguing, as you'll see in the subsequent interview, and arguing that Jesus is the Son, both in the sense of his divine identity, but also in his messianic office that he exercises in his human life. But that's enough from me talking about the book. Let's hear from Dr. Bobby Jamieson himself. Hello, I'm Mike Bird, and I'm joined with a very special guest, Dr. Bobby Jamieson from Capitol Hill Baptist Church, a graduate of Cambridge University, and you've probably graduated at a few other places. Bobby, where else have you graduated from?
That's true. I started off with a music degree from the University of Southern California. At that point, I intended to be a professional jazz musician, decided to go into ministry and theological training instead. So I graduated from Southern Seminary with an MDiv and a THM, and then did my PhD at Cambridge.
Oh, awesome. So you've been time in California, Kentucky, Cambridge. Now, if you are a potential jazz musician, I need to keep you far away from Con Campbell, who is a very good jazz musician. The man makes sax sound like the purest exegesis coming out of an instrument you'll ever hear.
I once wrote a paper on the middle voice, then it got introduced to Con Campbell as a jazz saxophonist. He said, "No, you don't. There's only one of me."
Well, that's good to know. That's good to know. But today we're not doing jazz. We're doing a bit of Christology. We want to talk about your PhD thesis on the Christology of Hebrews. And if I can refer to your own book, on one of the earliest pages, we get a really good summary of the problem that you're trying to solve. And the problem is this. So this is a quote from your book. "Is Son a title given Jesus at his enthronement as Messiah, his session at God's right hand, or does Son denote his eternal inclusion in the identity of the one true God?" And I guess that is indeed the question. Is Jesus' sonship kind of like a messianic appointment at resurrection or especially ascension, or is sonship something he has always had? Bobby, what are the potential answers to that question?
Sure. And just one clarification, this actually isn't my PhD thesis. The PhD thesis was on atonement in Hebrews, so work of Christ, and looking at Day of Atonement, how that's a model for Christ's work, that kind of thing. This was a kind of side project and follow-up that I did. So this one's more affordable. More people are likely to get this one. But anyways, Paradox of Sonship. The other one has the big price tag. So that is the question. There are basically three options. You could say about the Son in Hebrews that it's only something Jesus becomes. So whatever you want to say about him on earth, during his earthly life, this title of son and all the kind of dignity and honor that comes with it is only something that's ascribed to him at the exaltation. And so if you push that all the way, it becomes a kind of adoptionist Christology. And that might fit in with a reconstruction of early Christianity where, they didn't really believe Jesus was fully divine. Somehow, whatever you mean by his divinity is something he becomes after his death, resurrection, at his ascension to heaven. Another option would be to say, no, Jesus is eternally Son. He's eternally begotten by the Father. He shares the full divine nature, essence of the Father. And so therefore, what a number of scholars tend to argue is that sonship, in that sense, whatever it means by, Jesus becoming as much superior to the angels, or maybe, if you are my son, today I have begotten you, that must only be the revelation of a prior sonship. There must be something that's eternally true that's maybe manifested or something like that. Then more, and that might be scholars like Richard Bauckham, arguing for Jesus' divine identity. And sonship must be a prior reality. There's some more critically minded scholars who might say there's just intrinsic tensions here. Maybe there's different traditions running side by side. Maybe it's not fully coherent. Hebrews has kind of drawn on different things and melded them together, perhaps imperfectly. And so those are three different options. And I want to say, there's a strong element of truth in the first and the second, but neither tells the whole story. And that is, Son is both what Jesus is eternally and what he became. And that Hebrews is deliberately using that title, Son, in two different ways. One, to get at an eternal reality, who he is as God, and the second, to get at a genuine reality that is new according to his incarnation, that follows on his earthly career, his suffering, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, that then really is his enthronement and installation in a new office. So that I'm arguing Hebrews is really about a both and.
Okay, so we don't have to choose between an eternal Son or a messianic office of Son. It's a bit of both. How do you see that playing out? I mean, Hebrews has got this wonderful exordium and then this incredible catena of quotations, largely from the Psalter, that's talking all sorts of things. I mean, he even gets called God at one point. I thought that's a pretty good title to call someone. The exact radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, which is, let's give it a promo, which is very ontological language. And yet people often want to compress this down into some kind of adoptionist Christology, which is one of my pet hates along with coffee. But so why do you think Hebrews doesn't teach an adoptionist Christology? Because that's been a very popular view in a lot of circles.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think you're right to draw attention both to the first 4 verses and then to the next several, the scriptural catena that follows. And so the author of Hebrews introduces Jesus as Son. That's the main title or heading he gives, the author gives in verse 2. And then there's this whole series of 7 ascriptions, 7 predicates, 7 assertions about who Jesus is. And I think they run the gamut from soteriological achievements, things he brings about through his earthly career and his death and exaltation to heaven. But then they also go back far before that, to creating and sustaining all things. But then they go back even farther before that, like you pointed out, to some strikingly ontological language. To say that he's the radiance of the glory of God and the imprint of his nature, this is the ontological ground according to which he is the one through whom God created all things. This is the ontological basis on which he is the one who upholds the universe by the word of his power. So to create all things and to sustain all things is a unique divine prerogative. It is one of those things that distinguishes God from everyone and everything who is not God. And so I think Hebrews quite clearly, it kind of puts out this whole range of assertions about who Jesus is. Some of them make sense according to what he became as a human being and what he did on earth and then by rising again. But some of them sort of burst any possible bound of humanity and have to be predicates of divinity. And then, of course, like you pointed out, there are some explicit scriptural citations. The 2 most obvious ones are where he cites Psalm 45 and says, "Your throne, O God." I think that has to be a vocative, direct address in Greek. So he's being addressed as God. And then similarly, he just co-opts a psalm, Psalm 102, and whatever maybe messianic resonances there might be, whatever details might kind of be going on in the background, he simply says, that the Father addresses the Son. This is Hebrews 1:10, citing Psalm 102. The author asserts that the Father addresses the Son as Lord, that is, as the Kurios, as Yahweh, as the one creator of all things. So he simply identifies the Son as the God who creates and sustains all things, who's acclaimed in the Psalm. So that's a strict identification. You can't be sort of almost God. You can't be sort of almost the one who creates and sustains all things. He's identified as the one true God of Israel. So I think there's clearly a divine Christology right from the get-go in Hebrews.
Yeah, it's harder to have a higher Christology than that, even if you were teaching it in Colorado. I mean, you can't get much higher than that, your Christology.
I assume you're referring to the Rocky Mountains there, how high one is.
It's closer to the heavens, so it's, unless you're going to do Christology up in the Rocky Mountains or maybe in the Himalayas, you can't really get much higher than that in your Christology. Okay, well, I mean, there's also one thing that's always struck people about Hebrews as well. There's a lot of sort of contrast between Christ and the angels. Is this purely a rhetorical comparison, or is Hebrews taking a tacit dig at a embryonic angel Christology, or people who see that Jesus is just around one of the angels? Is the comparison with Christ and the angels kind of like, if some scholars would say because Christ is the first among them? Do you have a view on that, Bobby? Whether it's just a rhetorical comparison, or is there a tacit polemic going on?
I do think it is strictly a rhetorical comparison, and I think it's doing probably two things. One is it's setting up the contrast between the gospel of Christ and the Mosaic covenant that then follows in chapter 2, verses 1-4. Mosaic covenant mediated by angels, gospel delivered by the Lord himself, as the author says. So that's kind of looking forward and funding the exhortation. Pay more attention to the gospel, because even if this message mediated through angels was enforced in this way, how much more the salvation announced by the Lord if you neglect it? So I do think there's a forward-looking rhetorical impact. And I think I do think the angels serve an ontological function in the sense that God created humanity a little bit lower than the angels, but God himself clearly outranks the angels. And so there is a kind of ontological boundary marker here where angels are in one sense above humanity, but also quite clearly under God. And so I think by the precise ways in which the author treats Jesus as superior to the angels, that includes both the office he inherits as Messiah, and now he's reigning over them and over all things, but it also includes an ontological contrast. So God makes his angels winds, his ministers a flame of fire. They have this sort of changeable, God made them and he can remake them into whatever he wants, whereas the Son is the creator God himself. So I don't think there has to be a polemic against whether it's angel worship or an embryonic angel Christology. I think it makes sense on its own terms, using a sort of ontological kind of benchmark.
Yeah, I think is it Borkham who says that as God, he's more than the angels, but as a human being, he's made less than the angels. So the angels become like a benchmark for the nature of his being. He's as God more than them, but as a human being. That's where the Psalm 8 quote comes in, and the Psalm 8 and Psalm 45 kind of like, are the real contrast there.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, excellent. Well, how then does your argument that Jesus is both the Son in the divine identity sense and the Son in this eschatological messianic sense, how does that play out then over your reading of the entire book? And do you have what I call the 6-minute abs version? You get good abs, but just 6 minutes a day. Do you have the 6-minute abs version of this is how my argument plays out over the course of the book?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think one way I would say this argument takes you into the heart of the book and helps you have a kind of 6-minute abs version of Hebrews is that Hebrews is about the sufficiency of Christ, the finality of Christ. It's an argument, as Schlatter said, these Christians were asking the question, is it really worth it? Is it worth it to keep following Christ? And Hebrews' answer is yes, because of who Christ is and what he's done. That's the fundamental argument of Hebrews. And I think if you take, Psalm 110 verse 1 is a kind of leitmotif that runs through the whole epistle, and also verse 4 about Melchizedek, being a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And there's a sense in which Psalm 110 verse 1, this proof text for the divine identity of the Son as the, sit at my right hand, the Lord said to my Lord. there's a sense in which it creates a sort of undercurrent or foundation that precisely in his unconquerable divinity, he is the one who then also suffers, dies, rises again, is installed as Messiah, and is therefore the ultimate guarantor, the ultimate source of salvation, who nothing can threaten, nothing can overcome. So I do think, for instance, in other words, that his divinity provides a foundation for the soteriology of the epistle. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. So that he had to become, in one sense, more. He had to become a human being. He had to become a high priest. He had to be installed in office as the Messiah at his exaltation. But that's rooted in the prior and more fundamental reality of his divinity. So I do think there's a sense in which, seeing this both and, he's the eternal Son and the messianic Son, there's a kind of fundamental safeguard there, a kind of fundamental bedrock that these things are rooted in his eternal identity, and as such are, unlosable, unconquerable, not able to be improved upon. So I do think that that's how these things feed into the main argument of Hebrews.
Okay, well, that's good. That sounded like the 3-minute abs version. So, why would you buy a DVD about getting great abs in 6 minutes when you can get great abs in 3 minutes?
You heard it here.
You heard it here, exactly. Okay, that's terrific. That's terrific. What do you think is the most salient aspect of the Christology of Hebrews that we need to recapture today? Is there anything that you think was being neglected or forgotten? Is there any aspect of Hebrews that you think, I guess I'm thinking here principally of like church audiences, which is the bit of it that we need to recapture? I mean, from my perspective, the one thing I keep telling students is in Hebrews, the Ascension is really the big thing. And that's why I say bring back Ascension Sunday, because we do Good Friday, we do Easter Sunday, then 40 days later the Pentecostals do something, but bring back Ascension Sunday, because according to the author, out of all the doctrines there are, he says the ascension of Christ is the anchor for the soul. Yeah. It doesn't say that about the atonement or the priestly work. He says it's for the ascension. So that'd be my contribution. Do you have one?
Well, okay. If a point of privilege, I'm going to take two. I think first I'm going to go tweet. Mike Bird says, "Make Ascension great again."
Yep.
If I may, you just gave a little plug, actually, for the first book. Not the one we're talking about, but the one I did first, Jesus, Death, and Heavenly Offering in Hebrews, which really is about the centrality of the Ascension in Hebrews. And just to pick out a little bit of the language you used, I think part of the reason the Ascension is so central to Hebrews is that the Ascension itself has an atoning function. The Ascension itself is the completion of atonement, just like how the high priest on the Day of Atonement went into the Holy of Holies and there sprinkled the blood, there cleansed the altar, there got into the innermost dwelling of God, and in one sense rendered it fitting for human communion with God. He went all the way in and thereby granted access. That's Hebrews' fundamental paradigm of atonement. And I think that's compatible with his death having an atoning function. But there's a sense in which Hebrews links his death, then resurrection and ascension, zooms in on the ascension as a decisive moment in a whole atoning sequence. So I would say, actually, for a kind of church audience, I do think that's widely neglected, partly through a real lack of intimate acquaintance with the Old Testament sacrificial system. So that's the big accomplishment, or rather big contribution, I should say, big contribution from the book we're not talking about. But in this book we are talking about, I think I would say that Hebrews, just like you said from Richard Bauckham, according to his divinity, Jesus is superior to the angels. According to his humanity, he's below the angels. That's a sort of grammar. I think it fits Hebrews perfectly. I think it's exactly what Hebrews is saying. But when you talk like that, it's actually a perfect fit with what the church came to confess at the Council of Chalcedon. And even that, according to his divinity, according to his humanity, recognizing these things aren't competing with each other. It's not one versus the other. It's not if he's more of the one, he's less than the other. That's actually, I think that material assertion of Hebrews, that Jesus is both at once, is identical in substantive content to what the church came to confess at Nicaea and at Chalcedon. And so I think actually those creeds can form, and this is kind of the methodological contribution of this book, those creeds can actually provide aids. They can provide help. They can provide clarifying lenses to help you really go see what's there in the text. So of course, there's important differences of conceptual register, of vocabulary, these kind of things. I'm not saying there's no development whatsoever, but I think there is a material identity, and you could say an identical grammar. There's a kind of underlying commonality where Hebrews and the creeds are saying the same thing. And so I do think there's a sense in which that is, even though, a friend of mine here's one example, a friend of mine who teaches at a seminary in Africa, he inherited some students who had a previous professor who said, Jesus became some sort of disembodied whatever upon his resurrection. And he's just walking them through Hebrews saying, absolutely not. His ongoing incarnate humanity is crucial, and that's not in competition with his divinity. So I think a grammar of Jesus's being, God himself incarnate, existing in a divine and a human nature, that really is the material teaching of the book of Hebrews, which means the creeds are a help to understanding it, not a hindrance.
Okay, well, that's very good. So I would summarize that of saying no atonement without ascension.
Yes.
Which is probably a good takeaway, particularly as we enter this Lenten season. Okay, so good one to remember. And the other one is that the divinity and the humanity are important and compatible. And I think that goes to show that the church fathers who put together the creeds weren't just doing philosophical mumbo jumbo. They were close and attentive readers of Scripture, albeit trying to find a philosophical grammar that helped explain and was a coherent way of keeping together what Scripture was affirming and denying. Although, because there's a trend to say, look, Athanasius was good, but, he's a little bit flamboyant in his, use of Proverbs 8 and Colossians 1 or something along those lines. Now, I think books like yours show that the church fathers, people who put together, Nicaea, Constantinople, and Chalcedon, they're actually doing this on the basis of their reading in Scripture. And these are intensely exegetical arguments, which I think dovetails with a final question for you, Bobby, and that is, does Hebrews then have anything to contribute to the discussion of eternal generation? Because eternal generation is one of the ways the Father is demarcated from the Son, in terms of, you have an unbegotten Father, the eternally generated Son, and the Spirit who proceeds from the Father, maybe the Son, depending on how you stand on that. So what does Hebrews contribute to this discussion on the eternal generation of the Son?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I do think Hebrews positively teaches that the Son is eternally generated from the Father. And if you go back to chapter 1, verse 3, these two assertions about the Son, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. Both of these images are doing two things at once. They're saying the Son has all that makes the Father God. The Son has all that it means for God to be God. You can't have the very glory of God and not be God himself. So there's an identity here. But there's also a distinction. He's the radiance of the glory. He's the imprint of his nature, like a stamp, a seal in wax makes an exact representation, an exact match. So there's both identity and distinction. And what unites those things is that there's a derivation. It's one from another. Radiance shines out from a light source. A stamp makes an impress in wax. The wax receives the imprint from the stamp. So there's identity, there's distinction, and there's derivation. And it's really that derivation. That's all that the church has traditionally meant by this doctrine of eternal generation, that the Son eternally exists from the Father. We don't claim any privileged insight into what that means, exactly what it consists in, but that the Son eternally exists from the Father. He receives all that he is from the Father. I think these analogies from the created realm that Hebrews is using, and similar to how John might use word or Paul might use image in a divine sense in Colossians 1:15. There's a partial analogy from the created order. The reality that there is within God exceeds it, but this gives us a partial grasp of it. We can actually find something of that reality through this created analogy. And so I do think actually this is a material assertion of that teaching. It's talking about who the Son is eternally, and it's talking about who he is in relation to the Father. And there's a sort of directional arrow from Father to Son.
Okay, excellent. That's a very good way of putting it. So we can find some scriptural support for eternal generation. Okay,
I would say so.
Oh, excellent. Well, that's fantastic. Well, Bobby, it's been great talking to you. We've been learning about the atonement in Hebrews, the Ascension, the nature of Jesus' sonship in Hebrews. I think this has been a very informative discussion. So the book in question we've looked at is The Paradox of Sonship, which is published by IVP. I think it is what just came out this year, didn't it? 2022?
Yep, just last year, 21. Yep.
So 21. So it should be in a bookstore near you. Feel free to check it out, and I'm sure it will change and transform your view of Hebrews and hopefully enhance your view of Christology. So thanks to talking to me, Bobby.
Hey, great. Thank you so much for having me.